Julian Vance stood at the altar, a monument of tailored silk and cold indifference. The grand cathedral, choked with lilies and high society, felt less like a sanctuary of love and more like the closing room for the most important merger of his career. His bride, Isabella Davenport, was a perfect asset, beautiful, well-connected, and as emotionally detached from this union as he was. Her family's media empire would soon be folded into his own Vance Global, a move that would solidify his dominance for the next decade. He glanced at the crowd, seeing not friends and family but shareholders and strategic partners. His gaze landed on his mother, Beatrice Vance, seated in the front pew. She gave him a sharp, approving nod, her expression one of triumphant acquisition. This was her masterpiece, the culmination of a lifetime spent molding him into a king of industry devoid of frivolous sentiment. The priest was droning on about eternal devotion, a concept as foreign to Julian as bankruptcy. His mind was on the Q3 projections and the final details of the Davenport integration. He was calculating market share, not counting the moments until he could kiss his bride. It was then that his mother caught his eye again. A slow, cruel smile spread across her lips, a look he knew all too well. It was the look she got before checkmating an opponent, whether in the boardroom or in life. She leaned over to her husband, Julian's father, and whispered something. He saw her gesture toward the massive oak doors at the back of the cathedral. As if on cue, the doors creaked open, spilling a sliver of bright, unwelcome daylight into the hallowed gloom. A woman stood silhouetted against the light. For a heart-stopping moment, Julian's breath caught in his throat. Even from this distance, he knew that silhouette. Elena Rosales. The only woman he had ever loved. The woman his mother had systematically and ruthlessly excised from his life 5 years ago, convincing him she was a gold digger who had abandoned him for a better offer. He felt a tremor of a long-buried emotion, a ghost of a feeling he had trained himself to forget. But the shock was not just her presence. It was who stood with her. Holding tightly to each of her hands were 2 small children, a boy and a girl no older than 4. They were dressed in simple, clean clothes that looked painfully out of place amidst the designer gowns and bespoke suits. They huddled close to their mother, their large, serious eyes scanning the cavernous space with a quiet solemnity. A ripple of murmurs spread through the pews. Isabella turned, her perfectly composed face flickering with annoyance at the interruption. But Julian couldn't look away from the children. The boy, with his dark, unruly hair, and the girl, with her determined little chin. And their eyes. They both had the same eyes. They were a distinctive, piercing shade of steel gray. They were Vance's eyes. They were his eyes. The priest faltered, his words trailing off into the sudden, thick silence. The little boy, feeling the weight of hundreds of stares, tugged on his mother's hand and spoke in a whisper that seemed to echo off the vaulted ceilings. "Mama," he said, his voice clear and innocent. "Is that him? Is that the man from the picture you keep in the box?" The world stopped. The air crystallized. Elena's face, which had been a mask of pained resolve, crumpled slightly as she looked down at her son. She had not intended this. She had come only to prove to Beatrice that she could not be broken, that she had survived. But she had not accounted for the innocent wisdom of her child. Julian felt the champagne flute in his hand grow impossibly heavy. His fingers went numb. The glass slipped, falling to the marble floor and shattering with a sound that ripped through the cathedral like a gunshot. The sound broke the spell. Isabella gasped his name, a sharp, irritated hiss. His father was rising from his seat, his face a thundercloud. But Julian saw none of it. His entire universe had contracted to the space at the back of the church, to the woman with the haunted expression and the 2 small children who wore his face. His carefully constructed empire, his loveless merger, his entire hollow life, it all shattered along with the glass at his feet. The wedding did not continue. It imploded. Isabella, after a moment of stunned disbelief, had let out a hiss of pure fury, not at Julian's apparent betrayal, but at the public humiliation. "You have ruined everything," she had seethed, her voice a low venomous whisper meant only for him, before storming away, her father and his entourage of lawyers trailing in her wake like pilot fish after a shark. The guests, sensing a scandal far more interesting than a wedding, began to murmur and disperse, their whispers following him like a cloud of insects. In the chaos, Elena and the children had vanished, slipping out as quietly as they had arrived. Now Julian stood in the sterile silence of his penthouse, the city lights glittering below like a carpet of cold diamonds. The place was a monument to his success, all chrome, glass, and minimalist art that cost more than a house. It had always felt like a fortress. Tonight, it felt like a tomb. He walked over to a polished obsidian bar and poured a measure of scotch, the amber liquid doing nothing to warm the ice that had formed in his chest. He had not seen his mother since the cathedral. She had tried to approach him, her face a mask of calculated concern, but he had walked past her as if she were a stranger. He abandoned the drink and went to his private study, a room even his cleaners were not permitted to enter without his direct supervision. In the back of a secure vault, behind stock certificates and corporate deeds, was a simple, scuffed wooden box. He hadn't opened it in 5 years. His fingers trembled slightly as he keyed in the code. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was the ghost of a different life. There were photographs of him and Elena, taken on a cheap disposable camera during a weekend trip to the coast. They were laughing, young, and impossibly happy. He looked at the man in the picture, the one wearing a faded t-shirt and a genuine smile, and felt like he was looking at a complete stranger. Beneath the photos was a stack of letters she had written him, full of poetry and silly doodles in the margins. And then he found it, the last letter, not from her but about her. It was a typed report from a private investigator his mother had hired. It was a meticulously crafted fiction, full of fabricated evidence suggesting Elena had been seeing another, wealthier man. Attached to it was a forged farewell note, short and cruel, saying she had found someone who could give her what she deserved. He had believed it. In his grief and rage, amplified by his mother's constant, poisonous whispers about Elena's unsuitability and low-class ambition, he had allowed himself to believe the lie. It was easier than believing the woman who had shared her soul with him could be so callously erased from his life by forces beyond his control. His mother chose that moment to arrive, using her own key to enter his sanctuary. Beatrice Vance did not walk. She glided, a predator in pearls and couture. "Julian, this is a disaster," she began, her tone clipped and utterly devoid of sympathy. "The Davenport deal is in jeopardy. The media will have a field day. You must issue a statement immediately. We'll say that woman is an extortionist, mentally unstable." Julian slowly turned from the box, the forged letter still in his hand. He looked at his mother, truly looked at her, for the first time without the filter of filial duty. He saw the cold calculation in her eyes, the utter absence of remorse. She wasn't worried about him. She was worried about the stock price. "You invited her, didn't you?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Beatrice sniffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Of course. I wanted to show her what she'd lost, to put her in her place once and for all. A final little lesson. I never imagined she would have the audacity to bring offspring. Obviously a ploy for money." "Offspring," Julian repeated, the word tasting like ash. "They have my eyes, mother." "Don't be ridiculous," she snapped. "It's a coincidence. A trick of the light. That woman would do anything for a payday. Now pull yourself together. We have damage to control." She started to outline a public relations strategy, her voice the familiar, commanding cadence that had dictated his entire life. But he was no longer listening. He was looking at the photograph of the smiling young man and realizing that his mother hadn't just taken Elena from him. She had killed that version of him, the one who could feel, and replaced him with this empty suit of armor. As she spoke, he picked up his phone. He didn't call his publicist. He called Marcus Thorne, the head of his personal security, a former intelligence officer who was loyal only to Julian, not to the Vance family matriarch. "Marcus," Julian said, his voice hard as granite, cutting his mother off mid-sentence. "I have a job for you. It's the most important one I'll ever give you." Beatrice stopped, her eyes narrowing. "I want you to find Elena Rosales. I want to know everything about her life for the past 5 years. Where she lives, where she works, every receipt, every doctor's visit. And I want to know everything about those children. Birth certificates, medical records, everything. Spare no expense. I want the truth. And Marcus," he added, his gaze locking with his mother's horrified stare, "I want you to start by digging into every single action my mother took 5 years ago concerning Elena Rosales. I have a feeling you'll find something interesting." Marcus's report came less than 48 hours later. The file was thin, but its contents were explosive. Julian sat in his office on the top floor of the Vance Global Tower, the city sprawling beneath him, and read the words that rearranged his reality. Elena lived in a cramped, 2-bedroom apartment in a rundown neighborhood on the other side of the city, a world away from his penthouse. She worked 2 jobs, as a waitress in a 24-hour diner and cleaning offices at night. She had no car, relying on a bus system that was notoriously unreliable. There were records of her pawning a few pieces of simple jewelry, a silver locket, a pair of earrings to make rent or pay for medicine. Every line of the report was a testament to her struggle and her resilience. Then came the birth certificates. Leo and Luna Rosales, born 4 years and 9 months ago. Father, listed as unknown. Julian's hands tightened on the papers. He had been a father for nearly 5 years and had never known. The timeline was undeniable. He had been with Elena. These children were his. But that wasn't the twist. The twist was the last page of the report. Marcus, with his particular set of skills, had unearthed a ghost transaction. A wire transfer for $250,000, sent from a private account belonging to Beatrice Vance to a small, discreet medical clinic just weeks after Elena would have discovered she was pregnant. The recipient was the clinic's director, a Dr. Alastair Finch. The memo line was chillingly simple. For the Rosales arrangement, Marcus had cross-referenced the date. The transfer was made the day before Julian received the forged farewell note. But the money had never reached Elena. According to Marcus's preliminary digging, the clinic specialized in private, off-the-books adoptions. Dr. Finch had a history of preying on vulnerable women. He had vanished a few months after the transfer, the clinic abruptly shutting down. It was clear what had happened. Beatrice hadn't just paid Elena off. She had tried to have his children taken, to have them adopted out and erased from existence. For some reason, her plan had failed. Elena had kept them. But his mother had orchestrated the entire thing, believing for 5 years that her monstrous secret was safe. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it stole the air from his lungs. He felt a rage so pure and cold it terrified him. He couldn't just storm over to Elena's apartment in his chauffeured car. He couldn't send a lawyer. This was not a problem money could solve. This was a wound that needed to be cleaned by his own hands. He needed to see them to understand the life his ignorance had forced upon them. Marcus's report mentioned Elena's constant struggle with her aging, unreliable car. It was his way in. The next afternoon, Julian traded his $1,000 suit for a pair of worn jeans and a plain gray Henley he had one of his assistants purchase from a department store. He drove himself, in an unassuming sedan from the company motor pool, to Elena's neighborhood. It was a place of cracked sidewalks, faded storefronts, and the distant, constant wail of sirens. He parked a block away from her building and waited. He felt like an alien, a tourist in the land of real life. He didn't have to wait long. Elena emerged from the building, holding Leo's and Luna's hands. They were heading toward a battered old station wagon parked at the curb. He watched as she tried to start it. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. She tried again, her shoulders slumping in defeat. This was his chance. Taking a deep breath, he got out of his car and walked over. "Having some trouble?" he asked, his voice sounding rough, unfamiliar to his own ears. Elena looked up, startled. Recognition flickered in her eyes, followed by a guarded, wary tension. She didn't see the CEO. She saw the man who had broken her heart, the man whose face was mirrored in her children's. "Julian," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "What are you doing here?" "I was in the neighborhood," he lied, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. "Looks like you have an engine problem. I know a bit about cars. Let me take a look." He didn't wait for permission, moving to the front of the car and popping the hood. He knew his way around an engine. It was a skill he'd learned as a teenager, one of the few things his own father hadn't been able to monetize or control. As he tinkered with the battery cable, he was acutely aware of the 2 small figures watching him from the sidewalk. They stood close to their mother, their gazes curious and unflinching. He could see their worn shoes, the patch on the knee of the boy's jeans. He saw Elena pull a small, bruised apple from her bag and carefully divide it in half, giving a piece to each child. They shared it without a word, a silent, practiced ritual of scarcity. The sight was a physical blow. In his world, people threw away entire catered feasts without a second thought. Here, an apple was a treasure to be shared. The guilt was a physical thing, a heavy cloak settling over him. He managed to get the car started. It rumbled to life, an uneven and complaining sound, but it was running. "It's a temporary fix," he said, wiping grease from his hands with a rag he'd brought. "The alternator is shot. You'll need a new 1-inch. Elena's expression was a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. "Thank you," she said formally. "I should get going. The kids have a doctor's appointment." She wouldn't meet his eyes. He wanted to scream. He wanted to tell her everything, to confess his ignorance, to beg for her forgiveness. But the words were stuck behind a wall of shame. Instead, he just nodded. As she buckled the children into their car seats, the little girl, Luna, looked at him. She had a solemn, old-soul expression on her small face. "You look like the picture," she said, her voice a soft bell. Elena froze, her back to him. "What picture, sweetie?" Julian asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. Luna pointed a tiny finger at him. "The sad man picture. Mama keeps it in her drawer." Before Julian could react, Elena had shut the car door, her movements brisk and final. She got into the driver's seat without another word and drove away, leaving him standing on the cracked sidewalk, the smell of exhaust and the weight of a child's observation hanging in the air. The sad man. That's what he had become. He couldn't stay away. The brief encounter had only sharpened his need to understand, to somehow bridge the chasm that separated his world from theirs. He started finding excuses to be in their neighborhood. He learned their routine from a distance, a practice that felt both protective and deeply intrusive. He saw Elena walking them to a small, slightly run-down community park in the afternoons. It was the only luxury she could afford them. One day he went to the park himself. He sat on a bench, dressed again in his civilian disguise, pretending to read a book. He watched as Leo and Luna played on the swings. They didn't shout or run wildly like the other children. They played with a quiet intensity, always keeping their mother in their line of sight. He saw the fierce, protective love in Elena's eyes as she watched them, a look that sent a fresh wave of shame through him. He had not been there to protect them from anything. She had done it all alone. After a while, Leo, the bolder of the two, chased a stray ball that rolled near Julian's bench. He picked it up, hesitating. Julian offered him a small, tentative smile. "That's a good throw," he said. Leo looked at him, his steel-gray eyes narrowed in concentration. He wasn't shy, just assessing. "My name is Leo," he announced, as if it were a title. "It's nice to meet you, Leo," Julian said. "I'm Jay." The false name felt sour on his tongue. Luna, seeing her brother talking to the stranger, cautiously wandered over, clutching a small, tattered teddy bear. She hid behind Leo, peeking out at Julian. "He has sad eyes, Leo," she whispered to her brother, loud enough for Julian to hear. "Like the picture?" Leo nodded sagely. "I know." He turned his attention back to Julian. "Are you sad?" he asked, with the brutal, beautiful honesty of a child. The question disarmed him completely. In his world, no one asked such a thing. They asked about profits, about strategy, about power. But this small boy, who had nothing, was asking about his soul. Sometimes, Julian admitted, his voice thick. "Yes, I am." Before he could say more, Elena was there, her presence a sudden shield between him and the children. "Leo, Luna. Come on. It's time to go." Her tone was polite but laced with steel. She did not acknowledge Julian beyond a brief, tight nod. She gathered her children and left, her posture rigid. He knew he was running out of time. He couldn't keep lurking in the shadows of their lives. He needed to face her, to give her the truth she deserved. But his next visit to the park a few days later forced his hand in a way he never anticipated. He was watching the children play near a sandbox when Luna toddled over to him. She was holding something in her small hand, held out to him like an offering. It was a photograph, creased and softened with time and handling. It was one of the pictures from his own secret box, the one of him and Elena on the coast, his arm around her, both of them beaming at the camera. He felt the air leave his body. She had kept it. All this time, she had kept it. Luna looked from the smiling man in the photograph to the somber man sitting on the bench. Her little brow furrowed as she compared the two. "Mama says this was our daddy," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the quiet afternoon air. She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze a perfect mirror of his own. "He had to go away on a long trip." "Is that you? Are you her daddy?" The world went silent. The laughter of other children, the rustle of leaves, the distant city hum, it all faded away. There was only the face of the small, innocent girl asking the single most important question he had ever been asked. His lies, his disguises, his fears, they were all stripped away in an instant. He opened his mouth to answer, but no sound came out. He was undone. The tabloid story hit the next morning. It was a masterpiece of character assassination, clearly fed to the press by a source with an agenda. "Disgraced CEO stalks former flame," the headline screamed, accompanied by a grainy telephoto picture of Julian talking to Leo in the park. The article painted him as an obsessed ex-lover, unhinged by his cancelled wedding, harassing a poor single mother. It portrayed Elena as a frightened victim, terrified by his unwanted advances. It was a vicious, calculated lie designed to isolate him and poison any chance he had of reaching her. He didn't need an investigator to know the source. It had his mother's fingerprints all over it. Beatrice's attack was a sign of panic. She must have discovered through her own channels that he was getting close to Elena, and she had deployed her favorite weapon, public opinion. The story was a warning shot, a clear message to both him and Elena. For him, it meant, stop digging. For Elena, it meant, stay away from him, he's dangerous. The article had its intended effect. When Julian tried to call Elena, he found his number had been blocked. He drove to her neighborhood, but she and the children were nowhere to be seen. The curtains of their apartment were drawn tight. His mother had successfully walled her off from him. Furious, Julian doubled down. He called Marcus. The clinic. The wire transfer. I want to know everything. Find that doctor, Alistair Finch. I don't care where he is or what it costs. Find him. And dig deeper into my mother's finances from that period. There has to be more. While Marcus and his team launched a global manhunt for the disgraced doctor, Julian knew he needed an ally, someone who could get a message to Elena, someone she trusted. The report had mentioned one close friend, a woman named Maria, a fellow waitress at the diner. She was listed as the emergency contact on the children's school forms. Finding Maria was easy. Convincing her was not. He went to the diner during her shift, sitting at a booth in the back. She was a woman in her late 40s, with kind, tired eyes and an air of no-nonsense competence. When he introduced himself, her friendly demeanor vanished, replaced by a cold hostility. I read the papers, she said, her arms crossed. You should be ashamed of yourself, harassing her like that. It's not true, Julian said, his voice low and urgent. None of it is true. My mother planted that story. She's trying to keep me away from Elena and my children. He saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. My children, he repeated, letting the weight of the words sink in. Leo and Luna. They're mine, Maria. I didn't know. I swear to you, I never knew. He spent the next hour laying out a condensed version of the truth, the breakup orchestrated by his mother, the lies he had been fed, the recent discovery. He didn't mention the financial conspiracy yet, it was too complex, too monstrous. He just focused on his own ignorance and his desperation to make things right. I know I don't deserve her trust, he finished, his voice raw. But the children deserve their father. And they all deserve to be safe from the person who is doing this. Please. Just ask Elena to meet me. In a public place. You can be there. I just need to tell her the truth. Maria studied him for a long, silent moment, her gaze searching his face. She had seen Elena's struggle firsthand for 5 years. She had held her when she cried, celebrated the small victories, and cursed the man who had abandoned her. But the man in front of her didn't look like the monster from the papers. He looked like a man drowning in regret. She's terrified, Maria said finally. That article, it made her feel like a target. She thinks you're trying to take the kids. I would never, Julian choked out. I just want to help them. To be part of their lives if she'll let me. The bell on the diner door jingled. Maria glanced over. I'll talk to her, she said, her voice dropping. No promises. But I'll tell her what you said. 2 days later, the real escalation came. It wasn't a story in the papers. It was a phone call from a frantic Maria. Julian, you need to do something. Someone called Child Protective Services. They came to the apartment this morning. They said they had an anonymous tip that Elena was neglecting the children, that the apartment was unsafe. It's a lie. You know it's a lie. They're threatening to put Leo and Luna in foster care while they investigate. The blood drained from Julian's face. This was Beatrice's endgame. Public humiliation hadn't worked, so she had moved to the most depraved tactic imaginable. She wasn't just trying to keep him away. She was trying to have his children taken from their mother by the state, to disappear them into the system where he would never find them. It was a direct, catastrophic threat to the well-being of his children. The battle lines were no longer just drawn, they had been crossed with vicious, undeniable force. He had wanted to approach this with care and sensitivity, but his mother had just turned it into a war. The rage that filled Julian was unlike anything he had ever known. It was a white-hot, clarifying fire that burned away every last vestige of filial obligation, every shred of his former life. He left his office without a word to his assistant, got in his car, and drove directly to his parents' palatial estate, the tires of his car screeching as he took the corners too fast. He stormed through the front doors, the frantic butler calling his name to no avail. He found his mother in the grand drawing room, calmly sipping tea and reading a financial newspaper, the very picture of untouchable elegance. He threw a sheaf of papers onto the marble table in front of her. They were the preliminary findings from Marcus's deep dive, copies of the wire transfer to Dr. Finch, a timeline of her phone calls to the clinic, and a newly discovered Heavily encrypted email exchange between her private secretary and the clinic's administration discussing the terms of a discreet and permanent solution for a delicate maternal situation. What did you do? Julian's voice was a low growl vibrating with a fury that made the crystal on the table tremble. You didn't just try to pay her off. You tried to buy my children. You tried to have them sold like property. Beatrice placed her teacup delicately in its saucer. She looked at the papers, then back at him, and her expression was not one of fear or remorse, but of cold, reptilian anger. She was not ashamed of being caught. She was furious that her plan had been discovered. I did what was necessary, she said, her voice as brittle as ice. I was protecting you. I was protecting this family. Protecting us? He roared, the sound echoing in the cavernous room. You tried to erase my children. You left the woman I loved to fend for herself, believing I had abandoned her. And now? Now you call Child Protective Services? You would have them thrown into the system, ripped away from their mother, just to cover your tracks? That isn't protection. That is monstrous. Beatrice rose to her feet, her spine ramrod straight. For the first time he saw the true, unvarnished ugliness of her soul. That girl was nothing. A common waitress who would have shackled you to a life of mediocrity. And those children, she spat the word, would have been an anchor, dragging you down, diluting the Vance legacy. I built this empire with your father. I shaped you to lead it. I would not, and will not, allow some sentimental mistake from your youth to tear it all down. I did it for your own good, Julian. One day, you would have thanked me. Her complete lack of remorse was the final straw. He saw her not as his mother, but as a corrosive, destructive force that had poisoned his entire life. He pulled out his phone, his movements sharp and decisive. He dialed his top corporate lawyer. David, he said, his voice cold and clear, his eyes locked on his mother's stunned face. I want you to begin the process of removing Beatrice Vance from the board of Vance Global effective immediately. Cite moral turpitude. And I want you to freeze her access to all family trusts and accounts that I control. She is to be cut off. Completely. Beatrice gasped, her mask of composure finally cracking. You wouldn't dare, she whispered, her face pale. You have no idea what I would dare to do for my children, Julian replied, his voice laced with iron. He ended the call and turned his back on her, leaving her standing amidst the ruins of her power. He had severed the tie. He had chosen his side. His next stop was a small, unassuming law office in a modest part of town. He had hired the best family law attorney in the state, a woman known for her bulldog tenacity in fighting for mothers and children. He had also sent a team to Elena's apartment to help her deal with the CPS agent, armed with a preliminary injunction and the promise of a legal battle that the state could not hope to win. Now he had to face Elena herself. Maria had arranged the meeting at the law office, a neutral, protected space. When Julian walked into the conference room, Elena was already there, sitting beside Maria. She looked exhausted, her face pale and strained, but her eyes held a spark of defiance. She stood up as he entered, her body language radiating a fierce, protective energy. Before you say anything, Julian began, holding up his hands, I need you to know the truth. All of it. For the next 30 minutes he laid everything bare. He told her about his mother's manipulations 5 years ago, about the forged letter and the lies he was foolish enough to believe. He showed her the evidence Marcus had uncovered, the wire transfer, the emails about the arrangement, the proof that his mother had not just broken them up but had tried to steal her children. Finally, he told her about the anonymous call to CPS and how he had just severed all ties with his mother, financial and familial. He placed a thick folder on the table between them. This is everything, he said, his voice cracking with emotion. Every piece of evidence. Every lie she ever told. Elena, I know I'm sorry is a meaningless phrase after what you've been through. It doesn't give you back the last 5 years. It doesn't erase the struggle, the fear, the loneliness. I was weak and I was a fool to let her poison my mind. But I am not that man anymore. He looked at her, his soul stripped bare. I failed you then, he said quietly. But I am asking you, please, let me protect you now. Let me protect our children. I swear on my life, Elena, I will not fail you again. I will spend every day for the rest of my existence making this right. Let me be their father. Let me be the partner I should have been 5 years ago. Tears welled in his eyes, tears of shame, regret, and a desperate, fragile hope. The decision was hers. He had laid down his weapons and his heart at her feet. Beatrice Vance, stripped of her board seat and access to the family fortune, was not a woman to go quietly into the night. She was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are at their most dangerous. With her reputation in tatters within her own company, she decided to take the fight public to seize control of the narrative before Julian could. She scheduled an emergency press conference at the Vance Global headquarters, leveraging the last vestiges of her influence to command an audience. Her plan was simple and brutal. She would paint Julian as mentally unstable, manipulated by a greedy, opportunistic ex-girlfriend who was using fraudulent children to extort the Vance family. She would present herself as a concerned mother trying to protect her son and her family's legacy from a vicious attack. But Julian was no longer the passive son she had raised. He was a father fighting for his children. A loyal board member, disgusted by Beatrice's actions, tipped him off about the press conference. He had less than an hour. He called Elena. "She's making her last stand," he said, his voice calm and steady. "And she's going to do it in front of the world. I need to be there. And I need you and the children to be there with me. But only if you feel safe. Only if you're ready." There was a pause on the other end of the line. He heard her take a deep breath. "She is hidden in the shadows for 5 years," Elena said, her voice filled with a newfound strength. "She has hurt my family from the darkness. It's time for her to face us in the light. We'll be there." The press conference was a media circus. The room was packed with reporters and cameras, all hungry for the next chapter in the Vance family saga. Beatrice stood at the podium, looking regal and tragic, a victim in haute couture. She began her speech, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion, talking about a mother's love and the pain of seeing her son spiral out of control. "This woman, Elena Rosales," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with pity, "has preyed upon my son's past affections, bringing forth children whose paternity is, at best, a tragic uncertainty." At that exact moment, the doors at the back of the conference room opened. Julian walked in. He was not alone. Flanked by his lawyer, he held Leo's hand while Elena held Luna's. Maria followed a step behind them, a silent, steadying presence. A wave of gasps and flashing cameras swept through the room. Beatrice froze mid-sentence, her face contorting into a mask of pure disbelief and rage. Julian walked calmly to the stage, lifting Leo onto the platform before stepping up himself. He took the microphone from the stand next to his stunned mother. "My mother is correct about one thing," Julian said, his voice ringing with authority through the silent room. "This is about family. And it is about the truth." He looked out at the sea of faces. "For 5 years, I was led to believe a lie. A cruel lie that cost me the most precious thing in my life." He turned to look directly at Beatrice. "But lies have a way of coming to light." He gestured to his lawyer, who began handing out folders to the stunned press. "In these folders, you will find proof of wire transfers, forged documents, and witness testimony. You will find evidence of a conspiracy to defraud a young mother and to illegally arrange the adoption of her children." "My children," he paused, letting the words land like hammer blows. But he had saved his most powerful weapon for last. "My mother has raised questions about paternity," Julian continued, his voice hardening. "She demands proof. I agree. The truth needs no defense, but lies must be exposed." He pulled a document from his own jacket pocket. "This is the certified result of a DNA test expedited by the top lab in the country. The probability of my paternity for both Leo Vance and Luna Vance is 99,999%. He held it up for all to see. "They are my children." Then came the final, devastating reveal. But my mother's crimes did not end 5 years ago. While her lawyers are reviewing evidence of fraud and conspiracy, the district attorney is reviewing this. He held up another document. "This is a sworn affidavit from the social worker assigned to my children's case, confirming that the anonymous tip to Child Protective Services was made from a burner phone purchased with a credit card traced directly to my mother's personal assistant. She tried to have my children taken away by the state to silence them. To silence me." As if on cue, 2 uniformed police officers and a plainclothes detective entered the room, moving with a quiet purpose through the stunned crowd. They walked directly to the podium, stopping beside the now ashen-faced Beatrice. "Beatrice Vance," the detective said, his voice calm but firm, audible over the microphone. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and filing a false report to a government agency." The room erupted. Cameras flashed like lightning, capturing every detail of Beatrice's public downfall. She didn't scream or fight. She simply crumbled. The iron facade she had maintained her entire life shattering into a million pieces. As the officers led her away, a disgraced and broken woman, Julian turned away from the spectacle. He ignored the clamor of the press, the shouted questions, the chaos. He knelt, his entire focus shrinking to the two small children and the woman standing beside them. He looked at Leo and Luna, his heart aching with love and regret. "It's over," he whispered. He reached out, his arms enveloping them, pulling them into a hug. Elena knelt beside him, her hand resting on his back, and put her arm around the children, completing the circle. For the first time, in the midst of a maelstrom of flashing lights and public disgrace, they were a family, united and whole. The photograph that would grace the front page of every newspaper the next day was not of Beatrice in handcuffs, but of a father, a mother, and their children clinging to each other as if they were the only people in the world. 1 year later, the world of Julian Vance was almost unrecognizable. The sterile penthouse with its panoramic views of the city had been sold. The headquarters of Vance Global was still there, but Julian was not. Not at this hour. It was 5:30 in the afternoon, and he was in the sprawling backyard of a warm, light-filled house in the suburbs, a home chosen for its ancient oak tree and proximity to a good school, not its stock market value. He was on his hands and knees in the grass, his dress shirt stained with mud and grass, growling playfully as Leo and Luna scrambled over him, their laughter echoing in the soft evening air. He was a changed man. The cold, calculating armor he had worn for decades had been discarded, piece by piece. There were still lines of care on his face, but they were softened by a constant, gentle smile. He still ran his empire, but he did so with a new perspective. He left the office every day at 5, a non-negotiable appointment he referred to as his most important merger. His ruthlessness in the boardroom had been replaced by a quiet, decisive wisdom, and his colleagues had found they respected this new version of him even more. His greatest project, however, was not part of Vance Global. He had used a significant portion of his personal fortune along with the funds seized from his mother's frozen accounts to establish the Rosalie's Vance Foundation. It was a national organization dedicated to providing free legal aid, financial support, and counseling to single parents who were facing coercion, fraud, or malicious legal attacks. It was his penance, his promise, and his new definition of legacy. Every family they helped was a small step toward righting the colossal wrong that had defined his past. Elena came out onto the porch carrying a tray with glasses of lemonade. She watched him play with the children, a serene and happy smile on her face. The haunted, wary look she had worn for so long was gone, replaced by a deep and abiding peace. Their journey back to each other had been slow, built on tentative steps, late-night talks, and the shared, unconditional love for their children. It was a trust rebuilt not on grand gestures but on the quiet consistency of his presence, making breakfast, helping with scraped knees, reading bedtime stories. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the children finally tired, collapsing in a heap on the grass beside him. He sat up, pulling them close. Elena came and sat beside him, handing him a glass. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, simply watching the day end. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. It was the simple silver locket he had given her all those years ago. She had given it back to him months ago, a symbol of a past he needed to hold for a while. He opened it. Inside, the old picture of the two of them was still on one side. But on the other, where it had once been empty, was a new photograph, a recent one of them at the park, all four of them laughing, squeezed together in a single, joyful frame. "I was a fool," he said softly, his voice full of the weight of that truth. "A fool to ever let you go, Elena. A fool to not fight for you. I don't want to spend another day of my life being a fool." He turned to her, his steel gray eyes, the same eyes as their son's, shining with sincerity. "Will you marry me, Elena? Will you let me, officially and forever, make our family complete?" Tears welled in her eyes, but they were tears of pure joy. "Yes," she whispered, her voice catching. "Of course, yes." As he slipped the locket around her neck, Leo and Luna, sensing the gravity of the moment, scrambled to their feet and threw their arms around their parents' necks, creating a tangle of loving arms. Julian held them all close, his heart overflowing. He had spent a lifetime chasing power and building an empire of cold steel and fragile glass, believing it was his legacy. But as he held his family in his arms, he finally understood. A true legacy wasn't built of assets or acquisitions. It was built of love, forgiveness, and the simple, unbreakable joy of coming home.